Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to talk more about our movement than the country. I think I'm a little worried about the country, but I'll share a little bit more about that. What I wanted to do this summer was just help slightly move our country and our movement to a more unified, positive place and to grow a little bit stronger. What I did over the summer was I talked to Republicans who don't like Trump and didn't want him to be president, but weren't speaking out enough, and I was encouraging them to speak out more. We are seeing a little bit more of that, but that's what I focused on. Now, because I want to honor the separation of church and state, I did this as a private citizen, not as an ethical culture leader. The Ethical Society doesn't support political candidates or political parties, although we do support political causes. Regarding the ethical culture movement, I supported and attended the AEU assembly in Minneapolis. In both cases, these modest efforts basically focused on supporting the next generation of leaders in our movements and in the country. I hope that it's real contribution because I know, like many of you, I crave work that is real, work that makes a difference. So to honor all of you who are doing this work in various ways inside and outside the Ethical Society, I want to read a poem. It's one of my favorite to start us off. It's by Merge Percy. It's called To Be of Use. I think a number of you have heard me share this a number of times. The people I love best jump into work head first without dallying in the shallows and swim off with sure strokes almost out of sight. They seem to become natives of that element, the black, sleek heads of seals, bouncing like half-submerged balls. I love people who harness themselves, an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffaloes with massive patience, who strain in the mud and the muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals and field deserters, but move in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire be put out. The work of the world is as common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well done has a shape that satisfies, clear and evident. Greek amphoras for wine or oil, Hopi vases that held corn are put in museums, but you know they were made to be used. The pitcher cries out for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. All right, state of our nation, state of our movement. I'm going to discuss our humanist denomination the most, and then I'm going to explain at the end how supporting the next generation of leaders is what I'm going to focus on in trying to bring us back together. State of our nation. Deeply polarized. You all know this, you read it in the newspapers, you see it in your personal relationships. Silos of communication lock us into our echo chambers that reinforce our beliefs and portray others as deluded and unethical. Polarization is accelerated by those who weaponize fear and hatred. The manipulation of negative emotions has a history of centuries. The highlight probably is when the Nazis created the Holocaust by generating hate. And I've been told that these parallels, which you read about in academics, is overdone, but I'd like to believe that. I'd like to believe that The Handmaid's Tale in 1984 remained fiction, but then you read Project 2025. This theocratic, anti-democratic, long-range plan for America. If you do not know what that is, please email me and I will send you a number of links. Find out what it is, talk about it. Now, I try to seek middle ground and avoid polarization. But Project 2025 and MAGA extremism makes it very difficult because it threatens ethical values and the rule of law. I get enraged, and so I join the chorus decrying the unhinged populism that grew out, really, I trace it back to Reagan when he said that the government is the problem. That same sentiment, that sort of diluted and routed discontent, became a part of the Tea Party movement, which then contributed to Trump's ending up in the White House. He took over the Republican Party. So I talked to some traditional Republicans, many of them my relatives, this summer, and asked them why they are still hanging on to the traditional Republican Party of half a century ago. I asked them to join me in condemning Trump's extremism, autocracy, and religious bigotry. And some of them encouraged my efforts, but others were less enthusiastic, and they sort of downplayed my efforts. But I'm going to pick up again on my writing op-eds and letters to the editors that try to leverage my family's Republican legacy and urge Republicans to condemn MAGA extremism. And if that extremism is rejected in November, it won't end the hatred, but it will make hatred a less probable political strategy moving forward. The vote means, are you going to embrace hate or are you going to reject it? If hate wins, our nation is in deep, deep trouble. Now, our ethical culture community is not as deeply polarized, but we're not unified. We're trying to get back there. And that's why I was very pleased that the 109th Assembly's theme, the assembly took place in Minneapolis this summer, the theme was Mindful Stories, a Ritual of Care. Because we need mindfulness and we need care to bring our movement back together again. Those who gathered in Minneapolis and on Zoom did so in a spirit of reconciliation. We need unity in order to reverse some very negative trends. Now, the AU president, Condra Sears, talked about the fact that while some ethical societies are growing, notably Mid-Rivers and the Bergen Society, that growth is very uneven, and overall, our number of members are declining across the country, and have so for half a century. And it's driving some societies, like the New York Society, our mothership, to ask, well, what's membership about? And they're wondering, maybe it means something more than just showing up on Sunday morning. So they're trying to explore these other options. Now, Condra spoke about some long-standing issues, and one was how to attract a younger generation of humanists. Young adults are leaving traditional religious congregations, but they're not flocking to ethical societies. And to change this, all ethical culturists have to be involved. No board or outreach committee is going to make the difference. And there was something of a all-hands-on-deck call in Minneapolis. And I really liked that. It gave me some hope. I feel new energy there. Now, at the same time, we have to be realistic about some very hard conversations we have to have. And that's something that a member of the St. Louis Ethical Society who was at the assembly asked. Matthew Heil was one of my teachers at the lay leadership summer school that I went to when I was deciding to go into ethical culture leadership. I loved how his very, very insightful comments have always been wrapped in his wonderfully warm personality. Matthew, after hearing about the positive steps the AU was making, shared this candid appraisal. Quote, "You are all doing well at being transparent regarding the good things that you've done and the plans to improve. You've done a lousy job being transparent regarding the challenges and difficulties within our movement." Now, for example, Matthew mentioned that past misbehavior by ethical culture leaders, clergy members, have been mentioned, but very few specifics have been shared. And I'm not going to go into specifics today. I've spoken in the past about how arguments decades ago got out of hand. I've even heard about chairs being thrown at one ethical culture leaders meeting. I've spoken about the fact that more recently there have been misbehavior by ethical culture leaders that is very troubling. But some legal agreements have made it impossible to talk about some of the details. Now, Matthew also referred to conflicts between one of our societies and the national board, the AAU board, our federating organization. And most of you who are already involved in the national organization know that this is between the Bergen Society in New Jersey and the AAU. And some of these issues have to do come out of poor communication. I think a lot of human problems come out of poor communication. But there are real disagreements over strategies on how to grow ethical humanism. Now, these tend to reappear every few years. They're the same issues. If you've been around the movement a while, you may be feeling deja vu all over again, because we hear the same things. We get stuck in these cycles of debates. And I'm going to share some of these debates. One concerns whether individual societies should direct their resources to a national federating organization, or they should direct their resources towards local initiatives to grow their group. Now, when I was president of the board of the Washington Ethical Society, we had that same conversation 25 years ago, and we discussed leaving the federation, because ethical societies contribute a pretty substantial sum to keep our federating organization going. Philadelphia contributes about $11,000 a year. Overall, ethical societies contribute about $150,000 a year for a federating organization. So societies are trying to figure out this balance between sourcing a central organization while funding their local initiatives. And some people believe that we're too small an organization across the country to afford a central organization, that the AAU drains resources that could be better used by local societies. Others think that the American Ethical Union offers essential support for networking, for national ethical action projects, for leadership training that was incredibly valuable to me, for protecting our brand. What is ethical culture? And this issue is part of the friction between Bergen and the American Ethical Union Board. They question whether or not they should have to pay apportionments to the AAU for, quote, the services they get. And Bergen's actually saying instead of that model for getting resources, local societies should apply for grants, local grants in particular, that can fund the local society's projects around ethical action and other community building efforts. And in fact, Bergen's offering workshops for grant writing. Now, I worry a little bit about the unintended results of focusing on grant writing. Because quite often you get mesmerized into chasing funds that may not actually further your mission. So I think it's important to think carefully about that. Also, I see value in our national organization. I'm concerned that without it, we'll lose coherence as a movement, that we'll lose touch with our philosophy and our legacy, which is impressive, and that we disintegrate further into a number of small groups doing their own things. And I'm not sure whether my fear is legitimate or if it's misplaced. I'm not sure. On the national level, we wrestle with other strategic questions. For example, what should our primary focus be as ethical societies? Should we offer philosophical explorations at platforms and in classes? Should that be our focus? Should we focus on ethical action projects? Or should we focus on community building so that we can offer a humanist home in Philadelphia? Now, I'll admit it's easy to avoid that hard discussion by saying all three, and that actually is my position. But I would say this: I love philosophical explorations. And I hope that the ideas that I offer at this place help us bond together. But I wonder if I'm deluding myself, whether I would serve the Philadelphia Ethical Society better by focusing more exclusively on community building. Related to that is a big reason why I joined the Washington Ethical Society. I wanted to get involved in ethical action projects. I believe that any philosophical explorations or even a warm community should serve the actions of trying to make the world better, of trying to comfort the afflicted, empower everybody, and change systems so that they offer more joy, justice, and truth. But at the same time, I worry that if we too exclusively focus on actions, our community could become splintered into everybody focusing on their own pet project. So I think that we need a community and some philosophical consensus to help us hold together. Another overarching philosophical debate is whether we should embrace the status quo of our traditions the most, or whether we should look for radical change and transformation. Now, our membership is shrinking, our resources are dwindling, and that puts on more pressure to change radically. So we hear this discussion on the national level. I mean, Mike, our president here in Philly, thinks that the AU has need to be revisioned for a while. An example of a reimagining the ethical culture movement involved, one example I'll give is an AU resolution from years ago that basically acknowledged our links to white supremacy and systemic racism and promised to make a change. Now I want to emphasize this. Our national government has links to white supremacy and systemic racism. So this is not an odd thing to say about an institution that's been around for 150 years. And this resolution offered some practical steps to repairing the harm that's done. And many, many welcomed it. It passed overwhelmingly. It's an overdue and necessary step towards racial justice. But others felt that the resolution was too extreme. They said that it disrespected our history and the work of past generations. And some of them left ethical culture over that resolution. And that's deeply unfortunate. But it seems impossible to ignore urgent, difficult issues for the sake of a superficial unity. Now, in addition to those, and there's some other divisive philosophical issues, there are some process debates. How are we to interact as individuals? How are different societies supposed to interact and with the national organization? And how should we interact with the outside world? How do you do that? Now, I'll oversimplify things a little bit and talk about how do we interact here. Because our historical commitment to reason, we're a free thought and rationally based movement, focuses on rational efficiency. That's important to our members. A lot of our members are and I find at times, frustrated with communities that seem to be only focused on what seems like fluff, not getting things done, okay? It's my bias at least. So when we plan a meeting, we often emphasize setting the agenda, giving certain time for each one, and then moving through that in a swift manner. But others point out the truth that meetings, which are often a big part of how we interact with each other, maybe half the time I'm in a meeting with one of you, okay, as opposed to just talking socially, that those meetings have to address matters of the heart. So we begin with a go-around where individuals can share how they're doing personally, emotionally, socially. And there's a debate over, well, how long does that go on for, right? We got to get the meeting done, which is an understandable thing to say because the meetings are often at night after a long day and people are tired so they want to get over them and get home. When you have a bigger workshop, like a day-long workshop, how much are you going to, quote, get things done and how many breaks are you going to have? Right? How much movement are you allowed? Are you going to do music? Are you going to have informal conversations and so forth? So that's a debate. Now, at the assembly, Ann Clayson and Audrey Kindred offered a session called Holy Humanist. That word, holy, I think I've got to do a talk on that word, holy. I struggle with it. But it was a great workshop because it talked about celebrations that focused on non-rational things in our workshops and classes. Music and so forth and so on. So this is an issue that in summer school we talked about is the quandary of balancing task and relationship. How do you balance getting things done and getting into relationships that are worthwhile? Relatedly, the process of communication is easy to mess up. You have to have rational communication, and ethical culture is not always done well in that regard. Our communities are spread across the country, And we have different groups working. We have the AAU board, we have the President's Council that Mike's in, we have the National Leaders Council that I'm in, and often they're working on their own agendas, and they don't talk enough to each other. Now, the new AAU administrator, Greg Bonin, has done an admirable job of systematizing our communication, but we have to do better as a movement to communicate clearly. So you can't ignore the process issues, you can't ignore the philosophical debates, because if they're left unresolved, our financial and human resources are going to continue to dwindle, and we'll continue to struggle. Because in those situations, people don't feel heard. They don't feel valued. They feel disrespected. And that results in drama and trauma and burnout and mistrust. Now, young adults who step into leadership positions are particularly vulnerable to that sort of disillusionment. And I found it very hard to process, for example, losing Anya Overman from the AAU board this summer. And Liz Mulhall Collier, who also left a couple years ago. They both grew up as children in ethical culture, but as adult volunteers, they felt disrespected and drained. So they left. And professional leaders, like myself, have left the movement. A couple of years ago, I thought one of my friends, James Croft, left ethical culture. He felt that there was too much toxicity and dysfunction in our movement, and he's now in England. And very recently, we've had other people leave ethical culture training, for example. We cannot keep losing people to burnout and mistrust. In Minneapolis, at the very end of the board meeting, at the very end of the assembly, when it was all over, the board met for their final meeting. And at that meeting, leader Jay Hooper announced that they were leaving the ethical culture movement. They said that it was just too difficult in ethical culture. Stan said it was a deeply emotional moment. Jay shared that they were deeply hurt by the movement, that there was not sufficient employment opportunities, even to the point where they experienced food insecurity. And that is a tragic story of a young person looking to lead in ethical culture. We'll take a deep breath here. Because I want to shift to the idea of renewal. How do we stop these patterns? How do we nurture energy and enthusiasm in our movement, and then briefly at the end in our country? How can we bring joy and unity back? Now, regarding ethical culture, I want to return to the philosophical question that I asked earlier about, do we focus on philosophical explorations? Do we focus on ethical action? Do we focus on community building? And as I said, ideally we do all three. But given the trauma and mistrust of our movement at the moment, I think we mostly need to build community and ethical relationships on the national level. And certainly this can be done as part of philosophical explorations. I mean, discussing philosophy for me bonds me deeply with those in those discussions. And I think nothing bonds people as closely together as working together on an ethical action project. So those are all important. But being human is complicated. We are not born with instruction manuals telling us how to build ethical relationships. We need help. We need help even when that group of friends or people are a family. And that happened in my family. I am deeply embedded to the Washington Ethical Society's Coming of Age program, which came to us when my 3 children went through those stormy seas of adolescence. I thought everything was fine in our family, but I realized that the communication could be better, and that Coming of Age program strengthened our family relationships in a fundamental way, and I'll be happy to share more of that later with anybody. The complexity of human relationships was addressed at lay leadership training when I was involved. For example, they taught nonviolent communication, which is a certain approach to restructuring how we have conversations. Intentional and mindful methods for relationship building can help us connect with each other, and that taught us. It can help us connect with visitors who come into our buildings. Emily Newman discussed a program she's involved with at the Washington Ethical Society entitled Making West Welcoming, which she said does not rely just on being charming. which we all are, of course, you have to have systems to make sure that everybody who comes in feels welcome and respected in your community. Now, I'll admit that the Assembly in Minneapolis did not offer as many concrete ways to build relationships, but simply coming together in Minneapolis was the beginning of that. We began to share stories and reweave our national movement, so severely strained by years of COVID, heightened political extremism, and dwindling resources in our movement. I mean, Nick Sanders, who's been around the movement for a while, said he's been very aware of how our national movement has been weakened deeply since the pandemic. One member of the Baltimore Society, Karen Elliott, said that for her, going to Minneapolis was really important because of what happened between the sessions, at the lunches and dinners, the conversations in the hallways that let her get to know people that were just names around the country. She emphasized that we need more informal and personal connections across ethical culture. And right now, those three groups I mentioned, the AU board, the NLC, and the President's Council, are having more conversations. So again, another reason that I'm feeling hopeful. We need to communicate more regularly. It's one reason why Stan decided to run and is now serving as the AU Vice President to increase the interpersonal relationships. So let's give a little shout out to Stan for that, Stan. We have to communicate in all ways, in all forms. Regular formal communications that are clear, informal communications to build respectful, compassionate, transparent, and supportive relationships with each other. That is the spiritual engine of ethical humanism. We need to do that in our lives and in our communities. Where there's lots of philosophical commitment and interpersonal community building, we can build on each other. The philosophy can support the community. And this is where I begin to use the most religious language. I don't use a lot of religious language, but I use it when I talk about relationship building. I'm going to sort of move into that to conclude before talking about our country. There was one session that David Breeden, who was the minister who was just retired this summer from First Unitarian in Minneapolis, who hosted us, and Terry Smith, who's a philosopher and a member of the Washington Society. And they emphasized things that I love about ethical culture: the action orientation, the intellectual humility and lifelong learning, which is something I think we need to stress more. Adler deeply believed that you have to learn all your life and rethink your ideas and reimagine the ethical culture movement and change with the times. But they also stressed, more than anything, the importance of human relationships in that work. And that's the sort of religious element for me in ethical culture, or spiritual, whatever you want to say. You know, I'm a skeptic, I'm an existentialist, I doubt any sort of promises of the supernatural or ecstatic experiences that reveal the divine. I don't need that part in my life, personally. Promises of transcendence have been used to manipulate people for centuries, and I want no part of that. But I do experience a form of transcendence through relationships. Relationships with those I love, relationships with my community. Because when I became a spouse, or a father, or an ethical culture leader, I transformed. Parts of my identity grew. I became different. I transcended what I was and became more. Ethical culture celebrates becoming more as individuals and groups through flourishing ethical relationships. Now, I'll conclude with the one relationship gap that we really have to overcome in ethical culture if we are going to flourish, and that's the intergenerational gap. We talk about this difference all the time, this intergenerational difference. And there's one little statistic that I heard a while ago, I can't tell you exactly, but I think it was like 2 years ago when a certain study said that a younger generation feel more at one with younger people around the globe than they do with older or younger people in their own community. The world has shifted that way. So in some ways, the generational divide is even greater than it's been in the past. Given the demographic reality of ethical culture, if we don't bridge intergenerational differences, we're going to cease to exist. Some ethical societies have flourishing youth programs and flourishing Sunday schools. But here at Philly, in many societies, we don't have that strong connection to the next generation of ethical cultures. So we have to now tap into the wisdom of younger adults, especially those in leadership positions in our movement. So I'm so glad Julia is with us as an example of a younger person. President Condra Sears, although she sort of snickers when I call her young, despite the resistance to her efforts to try to shift ethical culture, has signed on for another term as the president of the American Ethical Union. That gives me hope. Now, we must be very careful to listen to her advice about not fetishizing young people. It's something we do. I fall into it occasionally. When young people come to our society, sometimes they are swarmed and surrounded and treated as saviors, and that feels very uncomfortable. They're just checking us out. But at the same time, younger leaders need to be heard. So Condra, along with the AU Administrator Greg Bonin, and the most recently certified ethical culture leaders, Louise Jett, Christian Hayden, our own, offer important insights into how we can evolve. Casey Slack does this at the Washington Society. They are trying to look for ways to weave connections between ethical societies. Julia Julstom-Agoyo of the Future of Ethical Societies need to be heard of. Rhiannon Johnson, the new secretary for the AAU, needs to be heard of. And again, younger and older are relative. But she's involved in an AAU intergenerational listening sessions, something that I think we need a lot more of in our movement. Because the novel perspectives younger leaders have of ethical culture, particularly how we can effectively build community and interpersonal relationships, are fundamental to our future. While acknowledging the importance of deed before creed, younger people seem less tied to the philosophical explorations that I so love. And I think at this point in our history, we need to hear that more. We need to reframe, rethink, and innovate. Now to conclude, I'm going to shift back to our nation. There is a link here. It seems the state of our nation particularly lighter than it did about 2 months ago. I'll admit that. Particularly because a younger generation of leadership is involved. As President Biden handed over the baton to Kamala Harris, hope blossomed in this country. Even Harris's selection of Walz was an intergenerational shift that tapped some surprisingly youthful energy because at first glance he looks like your cuddly grandfather. Walz is younger than me, right? Here's a statistic that'll shock you. If Walz is elected vice president, then re-elected vice president, then elected president, and then re-elected president, he would leave office younger than Trump and Biden are now. Okay? That is an intergenerational shift. Is this shift going to open the door to more people from diverse backgrounds in our national leadership? Are Harris and Walz going to, they were technically born in the last year of the Boomer generation, so are they that flip of the page? Are more women and people of color going to get into national leadership? Or is the backlash that followed the Obama presidency going to happen again? Are we going to be stuck in this pendulum swing between progressive forward movement and looking backwards? I don't know. What I do know is that in my final year as the leader of the Ethical Society here in Philadelphia, I want to support the next generation of leadership in our country and in our movement. I want to build more joy, more experimentation, more community building. Now, joy is no substitute for sound processes and policies, nationally and in our movement. But joy can serve as fuel for transformational change. I'm not sure if there's too much inertia in our institutions to allow for it, but I'm hoping for it. At the same time, I think like Mike does too, that the AAU right now is the best bet to try to lead that effort. I'm thrilled that the PES board voted to provide the AU with a $10,000 Rose Rappaport Long grant for leadership development in ethical culture, both lay leadership and professional leadership. If we can provide that same support on an ongoing basis, even better. In order to rebuild faith in ethical culture as a viable alternative to shallow materialism and traditional religion, to rebuild faith in our democracy, to resist authoritarianism and theocracy, we must embrace a generation of younger leaders. After all, they will be the stewards that bring the values we all care about into the future. Thank you very much.